Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chain Shatter build guide. I'm Zik, and in this video I'm going to show you how to destroy absolutely everything with this build. The idea centers around the Shatter key passive, stacked with aspects, uniques, and enhanced fireball to create a chain reaction explosion, detonating entire groups of enemies automatically. This is a very offensive build focused on diving in to freeze and delete entire groups before they even know what's happening. It will absolutely crush anything around your level, allowing you to churn through evil about as fast as you can move. If you're looking for a powerful and satisfying build to blast through mid to late game in Season 1, this is made for you. It will really start to come online as soon as you can acquire most of the aspects around Tier 3 and will only become more powerful from there. Throughout Tier 4, I've been able to consistently clear Nightmare tier dungeons with mobs around 10 to 15 levels above me at about the same speed. The only downside I've experienced so far is that the single target DPS is a bit lower than most builds running the burn crit passive, making larger elites and bosses in Nightmare tier 60 plus a bit problematic. However, I have developed a combat strategy for bringing down most of these elites, as well as a tactical swap to the crit burn passive that will allow you to conquer some of these larger bosses. Additionally, switching back and forth between Chain Shatter and a more focused single target DPS build to push the highest tier Nightmare dungeons is actually quite easy and only requires a few skill changes and gear swaps, with the Paragon board remaining unchanged. And speaking of Paragon boards, this build implements everything we've discussed and learned from my previous 3 videos about the optimal glyph and board setup for Sorcerer, really putting those ideas to the test. And I sincerely want to thank everyone for all the amazing feedback I've gotten on those videos, and it's because of you guys that I've decided to live stream my Sorcerer journey in Season 1. My standard for quality is quite high, and I always want to ensure I'm providing useful and accurate information. This often leads me to spending way too much time in isolation working to create these videos, sometimes taking me several weeks to complete just a single video. With all the incredible feedback on what I've done so far in Diablo, I think it would be best for everyone if I was instead live while I worked on these ideas, giving us all a place to interact and theory craft together while learning more about Sorcerer. So for Season 1, I'll be live testing my next build idea from 1 to 100, attempting to stream from 10 AM to 10 PM Pacific most days with a break somewhere in the middle. If you have any questions, comments, new ideas, or just want to say what's up, I'd be stoked if you stopped by and hung out for a bit. It'll be chill vibes focused on mastering Sorcerer and Diablo mechanics to create the most fun and powerful builds possible. I'll be live streaming on Twitch at Zikorik with a fucking 0, because I guess someone else is also named Zikorik, as well as on my second YouTube channel where I do more random gameplay stuff called Zikorik Plays. You can find links to both of these in the comments, and I can't wait to see you out in Sanctuary for Season 1. Note that this will not affect the quality or output of my videos on this channel. I have to do all this work and gameplay anyways to make these videos, so this is simply me turning on my camera and going live while I do that. You can continue to expect high quality Diablo based content from this channel with a current focus on mastering Sorcerer and creating fun and powerful builds. Now, let's dive into the Chain Shatter build. We'll be starting with overall combat strategy, followed by a closer look at skills, aspects, gear, glyphs, and Paragon board setup. You'll find timestamps to all these sections for easy navigation, but there is certainly a method to my madness, so I do recommend watching from start to finish for best results. The best way I can think of to describe this build is Explosive Frosty Crunch. Now if that sounds like your new favorite cereal, it could be, every day in Sanctuary. The combat strategy focuses around what I call the crunch window, which is essentially this few second window where you have everything completely frozen and can unload your entire ice shards clip into their face. Now it's important to understand exactly how the chain freeze mechanic is happening, so let's use my favorite way to explain an idea, an elaborate analogy. Imagine you're playing Counter-Strike, except you're a Sorcerer or Sorceress. To make things fair, it's 1v50. You grab an op and get an early peek down mid, letting it rip. Now imagine you're actually shooting ice bullets because you're a Sorcerer, and those bullets will pass through and freeze their targets. Your ice bullets also make your targets vulnerable, so they take more damage from everything, as well as ricocheting off of targets that are already frozen to nearby enemies. When your targets die while frozen, they shatter, exploding for a massive amount of damage to all the enemies around them. When they die, they also explode in an extra fully ranked fireball, because you have magic in your blood. Also, 1 out of every 5 enemies that dies while frozen will explode in a frost nova, freezing everything around it and making it all take more damage. Now imagine half the enemies that get frozen by these novas will spread this same freeze effect to nearby enemies that aren't frozen yet. And imagine that you deal way more damage to frozen enemies, stuff stays frozen for longer, if you can't freeze it you do more damage to it, and you take 38% less damage from everything affected by this chain of events. Now imagine you have an automatic ice shards turret on your back that will instantly shoot ice bullets at any frozen targets, which now that everything is frozen, will be automatically launching ice shards at everything. Once everything is frozen, your ice shards turret combined with your ice shards op machine gun will quickly destroy a significant chunk of your enemies. When these targets die and explode, everything that is frozen around them take all this explosion damage and then explode themselves for a large portion of that damage, giving you an escalating damage curve that will automatically detonate entire groups with this domino-like effect. So our primary focus is on freezing everything, letting that freeze automatically spread, and then blasting a chunk of those frozen enemies till they explode, which initiates the chain reaction explosion. Our primary methods of freezing are Frost Nova and Blizzard, with the chain reaction freeze automatically happening after stuff starts to die and explode. Frostbolt and Ice Shards can also be used to freeze, but these are better utilized as follow-up once stuff is already frozen. Note that Blizzard is primarily used as a utility spell in this build, to create large zones of freeze control instead of for damage. If you like to use Blizzard for damage, I'll share a small variation I use when fighting stuff around my level that lets you obtain rank 8 Blizzard with Ice Spikes, using it not only to freeze but also to pop frozen targets, initiating the chain explosion. Frost Nova is the main way you'll want to initiate your fights, and you'll want to get into the best position possible to unleash this Nova, which is why you see me diving right into the middle of these large groups of enemies. To enable this, it's best to use boots with multiple dodges so you're not left hanging after you dodge in, combined with using the Flame Shield Immune and Aspect when facing harder enemies to make sure you don't die before you Nova. If your Frost Nova is on cooldown, your primary initiation should be with Blizzard, creating a zone of frost between you and your enemies and letting them come to you to be frozen before diving in to delete them. Once stuff is frozen with Frost Nova or Blizzard, we are in the crunch window. This is about a 5 to 6 second window where everything is completely frozen, giving you the opportunity to unload massive damage without getting hit and initiating the chain reaction explosion. The idea here is to line up the best angle for your ice shards to hit the most enemies possible as they pass through. Think of it as demon bowling, where hitting the center pin, which has the most pins behind it, will give you the best chance at a strike. Once your build is fully online, you'll find that most everything will be dead already by the end of the crunch window. Bigger elites are the only ones that may survive, and the most important thing to realize here is that elites become unstoppable when you try to freeze them for a second time, and so there's about a 12-second window after the crunch window, where everything you have will be on cooldown, you'll be low on mana, and elites will be unstoppable. This, my friend, is where you get the fuck out of there. The goal now is to simply kite and survive these unstoppable elites until they can be frozen again. Rinse and repeat this cycle until they're super dead. When Flame Shield is back off cooldown from running into the initial group, it can be used to survive and burst during these windows and is especially great for surviving the lightning or fire mechanics of elites to get that final burst in. Now, I'm usually a staff guy myself, but after having used a staff, a wand, and a dagger with this build, I really favor the one-handed dagger for the attack speed, the close mechanic, and the utility of being able to switch between offhands. This also gives you a really good reason to get up in stuff's grill and drill it with a bunch of ice shards point blank before it explodes in glorious frostfire, which is quite satisfying. Now, a staff will still work quite well with the extra crowd control damage on it. It's just a bit of a slower attack speed playstyle with bigger numbers, and you'll lose the ability to run an additional aspect on your offhand. Wands absolutely still work for this build as well, and if you get a good wand roll, it's definitely worth using. I used a wand for a good chunk of the time. They're just the least valuable of the weapon types for this build specifically because of how little we are building into and relying on Lucky Hit. The only thing Lucky Hit is really doing for us is helping our mana generation. If you don't have Frostburn yet, you'll want to find gloves with plus Lucky Hit to primary resource, as this stacked with our Frigid Breeze passive will give us most of our mana generation when cleaving big groups of mobs. The bigger the group, the more mana we will get back from our automatic chain explosion triggering our lucky mana. Now, this is not a mindless infinite mana one button build. It's intended to be a deep and exciting kit to enable explosive gameplay, so mana is something you will have to think about. The main times you'll be finding yourself going is when you're only fighting a single target or just a few enemies, because you're not getting a bunch of the explosion hits to proc your lucky mana. This is fine though, as with primary abilities getting a recent buff, Frostbolt is actually quite good the way we are using it, especially when stuff is frozen, which turns it into a large AoE effect, further enabling our explosion tactics. To keep your mana up against single targets, you'll want to implement the old 1-2 punch strategy, which is essentially 2 casts of Frostbolt for every cast of Ice Shards. This will be just enough time for your vulnerability to stay up between Ice Shards while delivering max DPS with the mana you have available. It will also be stacking your offhand aspect, which will give your Ice Shards 20% increased damage on each punch. Additionally, we're running the Elemental Dominance passive, and so if it's possible to stay above half mana, that will also give you a damage increase. In general though, we're using elemental dominance to boost the power of our initial ice shards that detonate the explosion, which in turn boosts the damage of the explosion itself. So don't worry too much about trying to stay above half mana. It will really only come into effect and be noticeable when you're fighting single target enemies. The final tool in our kit really helps us survive the windows when we're low on mana and out of cooldowns, and this is our ultimate, Deep Freeze. You'll want to use Deep Freeze either as a huge guaranteed initial freeze against giant groups of enemies to start, or, more often, as a survival utility to give you a chance to regen mana and reset your cooldowns while killing off smaller mobs and triggering more explosions. The one downside I've noticed to Deep Freeze when pushing into higher tier Nightmare dungeons is that you can have some very unfortunate timing when mobs are attacking you right when it ends, and the best thing to do here would probably be to get good at canceling it early if you think you might be in a situation where this could happen, but in general, this is the exception and not the case. The massive freeze value, immune, and CDR the ult gives makes it very solid for this build the majority of the time. Now considering our defensive strategy, this build relies on one of my favorite sayings from my sports days. The best defense is a strong offense. We are really trying to kill everything in just a few seconds while it's frozen before it even has a chance to hit us. However, we still want to be able to survive when we do get hit, and we want to benefit from everything being frozen. This is why our first legendary node on our Paragon Boards will be Icefall, which gives us a 15% max health shield when targets die while frozen. This lets us end the crunch window with a fatty barrier from everything that just exploded while frozen. Because this barrier scales with our max health, and because more max health will help us survive getting one shot, we have a high priority on max health for our gear rolls and gems, which has put me at almost 13,000 health by level 95. This greatly increases the value of our Icefall legendary barrier because it scales with this number. The only other defensive stat we will prioritize, especially as we move more into endgame, will be damage reduction. This is why we are taking a 50% boost to the aspect on our necklace, giving us 38% damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. The rest of our defense comes from our combat strategy, an incredibly explosive and powerful offense that will freeze everything in place and delete it before it has a chance to attack us. If anything survives this window, we simply kite and try to stay alive with Blizzard, Deep Freeze, and potions until we can freeze everything again, destroy it, and win. Alright, so for this section on skills, we're going to be covering each skill individually and why we are running them. Gaining a deep understanding of this will allow you to use your skills more fluidly in combat and be more creative with your own playstyle. How to use the skills synergistically together is what we just covered in the combat strategy section. And before we start, I gotta give a big shout out to d4builds.gg, who I have no affiliation with but maybe would like to, because they seem to have the best comprehensive build planner out there and it just keeps getting better. And so I'm going to be driving around in here during these sections, but in general, it's just a great tool to mess around with because you can see pretty much every aspect of a build all in one place, organized very aesthetically with the Diablo theme still in it. And for things like gear and item slots, you can actually see what aspects or gear rolls are available for that slot. It has a great interactive skill and Paragon board. And in my very first Diablo 4 video, which was a beginner sorcerer build guide, I mentioned that it would be cool if they showed the level progression for skills, and look what was recently added. You can now actually see the order skills should be taken for the leveling path. So that's pretty neat. I don't necessarily recommend leveling with this build early game because it's not optimized at all for level 1 through 50. But if you wanted to, just because you're going to rip it in tier 3 anyways and don't want to bother respecking, I think it would work because stuff is easy at lower levels, but it's just mostly going to be ice shards damage until you get enhanced fireball and shatter. Anyways, this is the skill order I would take if I was going to level with this build, but honestly, if you want to level Frost, I think Avalanche with Frozen Orb is a better option, and that's actually what my first build guide was on, essentially a level 1 through 50 guide for a strong and easy Frost Sorcerer build. So I'd actually recommend running that over this for early game leveling until you get to a point where you have a lot of the aspects for this build online around tier 3. Alright, so starting out for our primary skill, we are taking Frostbolt. The main thing to remember with Frostbolt is that it's much more effective against frozen targets. You do a lot more damage to frozen targets, and if the target is frozen, Frostbolt will explode in an AoE effect, further encouraging our explosion mechanics. Also keep in mind that we are running Aspect of the Expectant on our offhand, so every time you cast Frostbolt, it will increase the damage of your next ice shards by 10%, up to 30% max. If you want to before a fight, you can actually shoot a couple barrels or furniture lying around and it will count towards empowering your next ice shards. And remember, the more damage you do with ice shards, the more damage Shatter will do when the targets explode because it's based on the damage they take while frozen. So stacking it up before a difficult fight will boost your first ice shards cast and thus the following explosion damage. The main time you'll find yourself using Frostbolt is when you are managing your mana against single targets, and the best strategy here is the 1-2 punch we referred to in the combat section. The optimal consistent DPS rotation with the mana we have available will be 2 casts of Frostbolt, then a cast of Ice Shards, because this will be just enough time for your vulnerability from Ice Shards to stay up on the target between casts, while also giving each cast of Ice Shards 20% increased damage. You'll find that with your Lucky Mana and the Glinting Frostbolt upgrade, this combo will usually keep your mana about even. It's also worth remembering that we are running Elemental Dominance, and so if it's possible to do this combo above 50 mana, that will also give you a damage increase. We need all the mana we can get in this build, so the bit of extra you get from Glinting Frostbolt will be quite a bit more valuable than running Flickering Frostbolt, since we already have very high vulnerability uptime with our Ice Shards, Frost Nova, and automatic Novas triggering from our explosions. Our core skill is Ice Shards, and just like Frostbolt, Ice Shards will always be more effective when cast against frozen targets. When targets are frozen, Ice Shards will have a 100% chance to ricochet off the target and hit an additional nearby target. We're running Destructive Ice Shards to give us consistent vulnerability uptime against single targets. You'll see we're also running a fully ranked upgraded Fireball, but we'll only be using it as an enhancement and will not actually have it on our bar to cast. I don't think this first upgrade is going to do anything since it's technically not traveling any distance, but we're mainly taking it to access Destructive Fireball, which will make our Fireball explosion crits significantly bigger. Ice Shards is our other enhancement, which gives us the automatic Ice Shards turret against frozen enemies. This one is great for a lot of reasons, but this is what will give you the automatic explosion effect when stuff gets frozen. You simply have to Nova and stuff will start to die and explode because Ice Shards instantly shoot out at everything that just got froze. In this branch, we're also taking 1 point in Devastation to get to Elemental Dominance, which you really shouldn't worry about playing around too much. The main reason we are running this is the boost to damage of our first couple Ice Shards casts that are triggering the explosion effect. For our defensives, we are running Mystical Frost Nova for the vulnerability, which will also apply to all the automatic Novas happening from our explosions, so this is a great way to keep vulnerability automatically up on large groups of enemies. We're also running Mystical Flame Shield, which will give us mana reduction while Flame Shield is active. I tried running Shimmering Flame Shield for a bit, and the extra health just didn't seem worth it because those are situations I would use a potion anyways to top off at full life, so I don't get one shot. So the extra bit of mana we get when we are spamming Ice Shards with Flame Shield active seems higher value. We are also running 1 point in Elemental Attunement, which give crits a 5% chance to reset one of our defensive skills, but can only trigger once every 10 seconds. This means that 1 out of every 20 crits will reset a defensive. When you trigger your chain explosions on large groups of enemies, the odds you crit more than 20 times is very high, and so expect and be ready for one of these cooldowns to get reset when you get a big explosion. This is also great for the way we are using Flame Shield to sprint in and position ourselves for an early Frost Nova to start the chain explosion. Once the explosion happens, the odds that one of these 2 cooldowns get instantly reset is quite high. Since it can only happen once every 10 seconds, any more points into this will not be very valuable. At the Summoner branch, we are just grabbing a couple passives. I think running 1 point in Align the Elements should be part of every single build for Sorcerer. When pushing into higher tier Nightmare dungeons, it might make sense to pull a point or 2 out of Snap Freeze to max this out, but in general 1 point will be enough since the max is always 40%. An extra 2 points will just get it to stack quicker, not increase the max stack. We're also grabbing 3 points in Mana Shield for the extra damage reduction, which we are trying to pick up anywhere we can get it. The protection passive right under it that gives us a barrier will not be very useful at all for us in this build, because of our 3 cooldowns, Flame Shield and Deep Freeze have an immune that lasts longer than this 2-second barrier, so it will do nothing. And then when we Frost Nova, everything around us is frozen for 4 seconds, thus it's not hitting us, so a 2-second barrier won't accomplish much other than maybe mitigate damage from any ranged enemies we missed with our Nova. Next, for our Mastery Tree, we are running Blizzard, but only with a single rank because we are using it for the chill and freeze utility, not for the damage. If you want to max out Blizzard for damage with this build, check out the variation section at the end of the video. Wizard's Blizzard is great for this build because of its name, and also because we pretty much always have a Blizzard up when we are casting Ice Shards, so this 10% reduced mana will go a long way. We're also grabbing 2 ranks in Snap Freeze just to give us the extra chance to freeze, which stacks well with the extra chance to freeze on our Frostburn gloves. These 3 points are the least valuable of the points in the skill tree, which is why they are taken last in the order. So if you want a couple more points to mess around with other passives or skills, or put more into Align the Elements when you're pushing higher tier Nightmare dungeons, these are the ones you should pull out. For our ultimate, we're grabbing Deep Freeze, which actually has some pretty sick upgrades. The first will give us a 6-second barrier based on how many enemies we froze while it was active. Note that unlike our legendary node on the Icefall board, which scales with our max health, Deep Freeze and Ice Armor are scaled off of base health, and so increases to max health will not scale this barrier. This is also part of the reason we are not running Ice Armor in this build. I was running it at first, but I ended up switching it to Flame Shield, which is actually much higher value for the immune and CC break. The second upgrade, Supreme Deep Freeze, which sounds like a cold pizza, gives us 50% CDR on our non-ultimate cooldowns, which are Frost Nova and Flame Shield. Note that this doesn't seem to be 50% CDR total, it actually just cuts the time remaining on the cooldown in half. So if you have 10 seconds left on your Flame Shield, it will reduce it to 5. If you have 2 seconds left, it will reduce it to 1. Thus, this CDR will always be most valuable if Flame Shield and Frost Nova are used just before we go into our ult. Now, this isn't necessarily how we want to play this build, so I wouldn't recommend focusing on that. The CDR will be helpful regardless of where our Flame Shield or Frost Nova are in their cooldown cycle, because we want them up as much as possible. We're also fully ranking all of the Frost passives in the Mastery tree, which are essentially just giving us damage increases to Chilled, Frozen, Vulnerable, and Elites. The top one, Frigid Breeze, is probably the most important because we will be getting a decent amount of mana back from this when our explosions hit a bunch of times almost instantly. The odds that we proc Frigid Breeze several times off one of these chain explosions, even with nothing else invested in a lucky hit, is quite high. Finally, name of the game, we are grabbing Shatter as our key passive. The main thing to note with this is that the damage of the explosion is based on the damage enemies take while frozen, and so focusing on unloading DPS into frozen targets will always give us the biggest explosions. Additionally, this is part of how the chain explosion effect is happening. When a bunch of enemies are clumped together and you blow up 3 of them with ice shards, the mobs that are frozen next to the ones you just blew up will take explosion damage not just from all 3 of those targets shattering, but also from all 3 of them exploding in a fireball. And they take all this damage while frozen, so they will instantly pop for a percentage of the damage of all 6 of those explosions. And if stuff is frozen close together, this chain reaction effect of escalating damage will continue to happen very quickly until the entire group has exploded in glorious frostfire. This section will cover our Paragon board and glyph setup. If you want to understand the logic for how we arrived at this final setup, I recommend watching my previous video, where we analyzed 3 different Paragon board paths that influence different parts of the damage equation to see how they compared. The final conclusion led us to this idea that we should be using all 3 of the boards and glyphs together in our final build because of how they multiply against each other in the damage equation. If you've already seen that video, you'll recognize this setup because it's essentially the same exact final setup that was recommended in the conclusion. You also already have a good idea of why it is set up this way and what boards and glyphs we are running, so this section will be short and sweet with a focus on what order we path on the boards and level our glyphs. Okay, so the idea behind the pathing here is that we are trying to access the maximum possible amount of valuable rare nodes to do things like boost our non-physical vulnerability and crit damage while picking up the most intellect possible along the way. Remember that intellect is essentially a straight damage boost for us since it has its own group in the damage equation, so anytime we can path through int nodes, we should do it. Around the first glyph slot, we are grabbing all the intelligence nodes possible, including the secondary bonus on the 2 rare nodes, which will give us a total of 70 int and max out the scaling for our enchanter glyph. For the other 4 sockets, we're grabbing all the dex nodes available within range because our other 4 glyphs scale off of dex. We are first moving up through the enchanter board to grab this 105% extra non-physical damage, then into Icefall to grab our legendary node. The reason I am pathing from the top here is because there is more int available and I can avoid the strength node going the other way, even if it costs 1 more point. To start though, it might actually make sense to path south first, because we are going to want to get to our 4th board, Frigid Fate, and access the extra vulnerability nodes there as quickly as possible. I also would recommend that if you're experiencing a lack of damage in this phase of the game, which should be somewhere around level 65 or 70, it might make sense to temporarily take Frigid Fate as your 3rd board, just so you can rush the vulnerability nodes and additional socket. Especially if you're not having trouble with survivability and don't need the extra barrier from the legendary Icefall node yet, this will give you a significant damage increase about 10 levels sooner than taking it as your 4th board. Once you have enough points total to acquire the Icefall legendary node in addition to all the vulnerability nodes on Frigid Fate, then you can refund your Frigid Fate board and reallocate the points to look like this. Note that this extra little path to the Frigid Fate legendary node will actually be the last thing we path to, and so I would recommend using these points to get to your crit board faster before moving down to acquire this 2nd legendary node. After we have our vulnerability and socket covered on the Frigid Fate board, we are going to move up to our 4th socket on the Icefall board and grab this extra damage reduction as we scoop up all the dex nodes within range. Finally, we will path over to our fifth and final board, which is Searing Heat, also known as the crit board. The main thing we are focused on grabbing here is our fifth socket with all the decks around it, and this 30% increased critical strike damage right in the middle of the board. And this bit of extra fire damage we pick up along the way is not completely useless, as it will increase the damage of our enhanced fireball explosions by just a bit. Finally, with our last few points, we'll make our way down from this vulnerability cluster on the Frigid Fate board to access the legendary Frigid Fate node. And what this is really going to do is just help our mana generation a bit, because most of it is coming from Lucky Hit. For all the clips you see in this video, I was making my way over to this fifth socket, and so was only running 4 glyphs and didn't have this extra 30% crit damage or the legendary Frigid Fate node yet. Now, talking about our glyphs, note that our final glyph setup is going to look significantly different than the order in which we level and socket them. So for our final setup, we're running Enchanter in our first socket on the starting board, Exploit in the Enchanter board, Control in the Icefall board, Destruction in the Searing Heat board, and Tactician in the Frigid Fate board. Exploit and Destruction are our 2 highest value deck scaling glyphs, so we have them in the 2 boards with 39 total decks available. Control is the next highest, so it will be in the Icefall board with 34 decks available. Tactician is different because its raw stats don't scale off of decks. It only needs 25 decks to bring the additional bonus online. This makes Frigid Fate the perfect board for Tactician because there's only 29 decks available within range of that socket anyways, just enough to bring the additional bonus online. Additionally, its effect will give us a nice little boost to the rare nodes within range, which should equate to an extra 12.5% vulnerability, 25 intelligence, and 15% cold resist once the glyph is fully ranked. Now, the order we should level and socket our glyphs looks a bit different than the final setup. You'll first want to get all the glyphs you are using to 15, as this is when they gain their second range and become truly effective. Starting out, leveling 1 to 15, you should first level the Enchanter glyph for your first socket, then Exploit for your second socket, then Control for your third socket, then Destruction for your fourth socket, and finally Tactician for your fifth socket. If you want to wait on leveling Tactician to 15 until after you've maxed out a couple of your main glyphs because you're ahead on glyph XP and you're far away from your fifth socket still, that's totally cool and a good idea. The order we're socketing is based on which glyphs are most valuable as we're leveling, versus the final glyph setup, which is trying to maximize the scaling value of each glyph based on the stat nodes available around it. Once you unlock your fifth socket, you should rearrange the glyphs to look like they do in this final setup to get the max value out of their scaling. Now, going from level 15 to 21, which is the current max level for glyphs, I actually recommend doing Destruction first, because it's around this phase in the game that our crit damage will start to become extremely valuable. So for leveling from 15 to max, I recommend this order. First Destruction, then Exploit, then Enchanter third, followed by Control, and finally Tactician. And I know all this can seem a bit confusing. I did my very best to explain the leveling paths clearly, but there's a lot going on here. So if you have any questions, you can leave a comment and I'll get to it as soon as I can, or you can try to catch me live if you want a quicker answer. Alright, so for aspects and gear, it's important to first just have a general understanding of what stats we are trying to prioritize with this build. Then we'll look at each gear slot for the specific aspect and stat priorities, and finally I'll show you some different variations and gear swaps worth considering for different situations. It's also worth pointing out that the best way to acquire BIS gear for any build is to look for the stats that you're after on yellow items, specifically sacred yellow items in tier 3 and ancestral yellow items in tier 4. It's very rare that you'll find a legendary that has the perfect stat rolls combined with the perfect aspect you need, so you'll need to craft your own. Simply look for legendaries with the aspects you need and extract them at the occultist. Then look for yellow items with 3 out of 4 rolls that would be good for this build. Re-roll the 4th and weakest roll at the occultist, which is called enchanting, to try to get something better. Once you have a yellow item with a solid item level and 4 good rolls, imprint it with the appropriate aspect that you extracted from the legendaries. Add a gem slot if it's missing one, then upgrade it at the jeweler or blacksmith, and boom, you have a BIS item for this build. This is how I build all of my gear for all of my builds, and will give you a consistent way to stay close to BIS for the majority of the time you play this build. Okay, so as far as our stat priority, the main defensive stats we're prioritizing will be max life and damage reduction. You'll really want to grab these rolls wherever you can find them, and these stats will become increasingly more important the higher tier nightmare dungeons you want to do. Max life helps us not get one shot and scales our Icefall legendary barrier, and damage reduction allows us to take less total damage from enemy attacks, further helping us not get one-shot. If you wanted to add a third defensive stat, I think dodge can be quite useful sometimes, as I've definitely dodged some things that likely would have one-shot me. For offensive stats, you're going to want to pick up extra intelligence pretty much anywhere you can find it. You should think of intelligence as direct damage scaling for Sorcerer. Intelligence is in its own group in the damage equation, so it gets multiplied by all the other groups, and it is non-conditional, meaning it's active 100% of the time. Next in priority should be crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerability damage. Because we are starting our Paragon board with a non-physical damage focus, we already have a 240% increase to non-physical damage active all the time in the damage modifier group of the damage equation. That means that any crit or vulnerability we build will be multiplied by this already large number, since they have their own groups in the equation. So prioritizing crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerability damage wherever we can get it on our gear will give us the largest damage increase. Next in priority should be all damage, cold damage, and frost skill damage. These are all non-conditional modifiers in the fourth group, and so will be added with the non-physical damage bonus from the enchanter board and glyph, but will be multiplied by the vulnerability board and glyph, which are frigid fate and exploit, and will also be multiplied by the crit board and glyph, which are searing heat and destruction. From what I can tell, frost skill damage works exactly like cold damage, so I'm not sure why they are even separate stat rolls. If anyone has any additional intel on this, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Also, keep in mind that part of what we discussed in my previous videos was that there's a potential tooltip error in the game, and your total cold damage may actually be lower than the tooltip shows. For more information on this, check out the study in the pinned comment on my previous 3 videos. Our final priority should be any conditional modifiers that we have a decent amount of uptime on, which are mainly crowd control, frozen, and chilled. Remember that chilled and frozen are different states, so any bonus to chilled enemies won't be applied while they are frozen. Crowd control, however, applies to both of these states, so it should always be prioritized first. Alright, so now let's take a look at our specific aspects in gear stat priority, starting off with the helmet. So for our helmet, we're going to be taking the Exploiters aspect, which will give us 20% crowd control duration to expand the length of our crunch window, as well as a significant damage bonus against unstoppable targets, which includes bosses. For our helmet stats, max life and intelligence are top priority, followed by crowd control duration. For the fourth role, there's a couple options that could be good, which include max mana, cooldown reduction, and life on kill. For our chest, we're running Aspect of Shared Misery, which gives all of our chill and freeze effects a 50% chance to spread when we hit that enemy. This is part of the chain reaction explosion effect, because 1 out of every 5 things that explodes unleashes a full frost nova, and then when any other explosion damage hits anything that was affected by that nova, it will spread to another nearby enemy half the time. For our stat rolls, our main priority will be max life and intelligence, followed by damage reduction, damage, cold damage, and frost skill damage. For our gloves, we are running the unique item Frostburn, which has some really solid base stat rolls for this build, combined with an additional lucky hit effect to freeze enemies for 2 seconds. If you don't have Frostburn yet, you'll want to first prioritize Lucky Hit Chance to Restore Primary Resource on your gloves, as this stacked with Frigid Breeze is our main form of mana generation from our explosions. Secondarily, you'll want to prioritize additional ranks of Ice Shards, as this will directly scale the percent damage of the skill and is the main stat Frostburn is missing. Intelligence and critical strike chance should be prioritized after that, with a few other rolls like attack speed and chance to heal being decent. Our Iceheart Braze, I don't know how to say that, Braze? Our Iceheart Braze pants, these are my favorite. This was actually the first unique drop that I got on my character that happened right after I got to tier 3, and is actually the original inspiration for this build, because I saw this unique effect and I was like, holy shit, that's wicked cool. How can we get a bunch of novas just exploding everywhere? And now we're here. Alright, so these pants are probably the most important item for this build to be fully online, as this has the unique effect to trigger automatic frost novas when enemies die while frozen. These are worth using even if you have the worst rolls at the lowest item level, just because of how good this unique effect is for this build. Its base stat rolls are also really solid for how we are playing. If you don't have these pants yet, don't worry, they will come, but in the meantime, I would prioritize max life and intelligence, and then damage reduction, and then dodge chance on your pants. For our boots, we actually have a couple solid options. I run all 3 depending on the scenario. The 2 uniques available for this slot can be quite good for this build. I actually favor Esu's Heirloom for fighting stuff around my level because when you dive in with the move speed bonus, it gives you around a 15% extra crit chance on your initial burst that triggers the explosions. Penitent Greaves will really only be useful for this build if you're fighting harder enemies and kiting backward, otherwise stuff is dead already before it has a chance to interact with the chilled ground you leave behind. I think the best option overall, and especially for pushing higher tier nightmare dungeons, is actually neither of these boots, and instead running Aspect of Binding Embers on boots that give you multiple dodges. This will let you dive in and out of large groups of enemies to unleash the best Frost Novas, and the ability to move through enemies with Flame Shield becomes increasingly valuable as mob density increases and helps you not get trapped or stuck when trying to dip in and out of large groups of enemies. For stats on boots, we should always prioritize move speed first, followed by intelligence, and then mana cost reduction and dodge chance. Amulet is actually one of my favorite item slots because of the variety of rolls that are possible. For our main amulet, we'll want to run the Ever-Living aspect. This gives us significant damage reduction against enemies that are vulnerable, which will be the majority of the stuff we are fighting. Our first stat priority should be extra ranks of the Elemental Dominance passive, followed by intelligence and damage reduction. Then, all damage or frost skill damage, and finally, movement speed, crowd control duration, mana cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. Now our rings give us the opportunity to get a lot of the high value damage stats we are after, specifically crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerability damage. It's important to try to acquire these stats here, as the only other place we can get most of them is on our weapon. You'll want to try to stack these with max life rolls if you can. Cold damage is a close second for damage stat priority and will definitely help scale your damage, just not quite as much as crit or vulnerable. For our first ring, we are running Aspect of Control, which gives us a significant damage boost to frozen enemies to help us delete stuff during the crunch window. For our second ring, we are running the Shattered aspect, which significantly amps the damage of our Shatter explosions. There are some other situational ring aspects that are worth considering that we will discuss in a minute when we look at my gear. For our offhand, we're running Aspect of the Expectant, which enables the 1-2 punch mechanic we discussed in the combat section. Offhands also have some cool stat rolls available, and this gives us another chance to get a lucky hit roll to restore primary resource, so this will be top priority for this slot, followed by crit chance and intelligence, which are close seconds, and finally crowd control duration, cooldown reduction, mana cost reduction, and life on kill. On our weapon, we are running Aspect of Piercing Cold, which is probably our most important aspect as this lets ice shards pierce enemies, which is essential for this build. For weapon stats, we'll want to prioritize critical strike damage and vulnerability damage first, followed by intelligence, then core skill damage, damage to crowd control, damage to frozen, and damage to chilled. It's important to note here that if you're running a staff, I highly suggest switching Aspect of Piercing Cold over to your ring and running Aspect of Control on your weapon, because the extra 35% damage to frozen enemies will be more valuable than the extra piercing effect that Aspect of Piercing Cold gives when applied to a two-handed weapon. Finally, for gems, you'll want to slot all your gear with rubies to really increase the value of all the max health rolls we are after. Skulls for all your jewelry, because there isn't really a better option since resistances don't seem to be working as intended right now, as well as the fact that armor makes up half of your damage reduction against spells anyways. Then for weapon, I actually like to run both Emerald and Sapphire, one in my main hand and one in my offhand, because both are very good with this build and have slightly different uptime depending on the situation, so running both covers both of our bases for those different situations, as well as gives us the full 24% crit damage increase when both vulnerable and crowd control are active together, which is quite often. Dope, so now let's take a look at the gear I was running during this video and discuss some tactical swaps you could make for different situations. When I'm fighting stuff around my level, I like to trade out my crit sticks for my Blizzard Flower. Having an alternate offhand with Glacial Aspect is a super easy way to power up Blizzard with Ice Spikes, which also do more damage to frozen enemies from the same aspect. You should also consider having an alternate necklace to pair with this with more offensive stats, specifically an extra 3 ranks to Mastery skills, which will let you get to rank 8 Blizzard. I like to run Smiting Aspect on my offensive necklace as it pairs perfectly with this build, but the extra damage reduction we get from Ever-Living Aspect is too good to give up when pushing into Nightmare Dungeons. So when fighting easier stuff around my level, I trade my defensive necklace for an offensive necklace like this, with Smiting Aspect, extra ranks for Blizzard, and some other offensive rolls. The only additional thing you have to do to be in Blizzard mode is pull 1 point out of Mana Shield, 2 points out of Snap Freeze, and 1 point out of Icy Veil. Drop these 4 extra points into Blizzard and voila, you now have a rank 8 Blizzard with ice spikes to start popping your explosions. Switching to the crit burn passive Devouring Blaze to take on harder bosses is a similar idea. You'll want to find an alternate necklace with a maxed out roll for the Devouring Blaze passive. I like to prioritize damage reduction on this amulet to help me survive during boss fights when I inevitably get hit by all the mechanics I'm trying to dodge, and we'll still be running Ever-Living Aspect on this neck for the same reason. Then in our skill tree, we'll again pull our first 3 points out of Snap Freeze and Icy Veil, and then all 7 points out of Fireball, giving us 10 total to work with. We'll then put 1 into Inner Flames to get to Devouring Blaze, and max that out with another 3. Stacked with your amulet, you'll now be at rank 6 Devouring Blaze, which will give you an extra 60% crit damage against burning enemies. We will then fully rank Firebolt, and then add 1 more point to align the elements for the extra damage reduction. Finally, and most importantly, don't forget this step or none of this will work, we'll change our enhancements over to Firebolt and Flame Shield. This will cause direct damage from our skills to add a burn effect, which is what we need for Devouring Blaze to be active. The Flame Shield enhancement will also give us an extra life in case we fuck up. Since there generally aren't huge groups of mobs that we need to cleave during boss fights, enhanced Ice Shards and Fireball aren't nearly as valuable, and they will never trigger on the boss itself because bosses can't be frozen and it will only explode on a Fireball once it's already dead. Remember again that if you're running a staff, you'll want to switch the aspect of Piercing Cold to a ring and aspect of Control to your staff. This will give you a 70% damage increase to frozen targets, which seems much higher value than the additional piercing effect that the aspect of Piercing Cold gives when applied to a two-handed weapon. A couple other situational swaps worth considering are an extra ring with aspect of the Umbral, which will essentially give you unlimited mana a lot of the time with this build. I usually switch this with my ring that has the Shattered aspect when the stuff I'm fighting doesn't need the extra explosion damage to pop. I also have a ring with aspect of the Frozen Tundra if I want to amp my ice spikes when running the Blizzard variation. Finally, I always like to carry some teleport boots around when I'm not running it as a skill. In case I need to use teleport, I can just equip my boots instead of respecking anything in my skill tree. I also carry a lot of other gear with me for a lot of different reasons because I'm a mega nerd and I like to test different stuff. Boom, we did it. These take me forever to make. I hope you found it valuable. If you have any questions or ideas or end up trying this build yourself, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'll be live streaming my next build idea for Sorcerer during Season 1, so be sure to stop by if you have any questions or comments about this build that you want to ask me live, or if you want to see what I'm working on next. You'll find my live stream at Zikorik with a 0 on Twitch, and my second YouTube channel where I do more random gameplay stuff, Zikorik Plays. And I want you to remember that this is simply a guide and not a rulebook, so take the concepts and adapt them to your own playstyle. If something doesn't feel right, experiment with other options to see what feels best for the way you like to play. Everyone likes to kill demons a bit differently, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I hope this build will be as fun and exciting for you as it has been for me, and remember to savor the flavor of that explosive frosty crunch. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace. Cultist Massacre! I actually got the fucking... Dude, that was sick as fuck.